Okay, if you're here for the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium virtual presentation on neuromodulation as it relates to the preferences of the end user community, you're in the right place. We have done extensive project work in developing the survey, which led to statistically significant results, and that result package is already beginning to impact the stakeholder community and hopefully beyond. We have three speakers today. We have Tracy Wheeler, PhD from Craig H. Neilsen Foundation, Jen French, and Dennis Barbeau. Tracy is with Craig H. Neilsen Funding Foundation, has an extensive background in scientific research, including as a consultant to DARPA. The Neilsen Foundation is the world's largest private funding organization dedicated to spinal cord injury and spinal cord injury research, care, and curative measures. Tracy?
All right, thank you very much for the introduction. So yes, I'm with the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation, and let me share my screen. Can you see it or no? Here.
Yeah, not yet, Tracy.
It should be.
Here it comes.
Is it good?
You're on.
Okay, so I'm with the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation, and I wanted to talk a little bit about the work that we've been doing with my co-speakers in really trying to focus our efforts on engaging stakeholders and why that's so important to us. So before I begin though, I do want to spend a couple minutes and talk to you a little bit about the foundation and our founder. So really you get a good idea of how important this initiative is to the foundation. So our founder, Craig Neilsen, I gotta use my, it's not advancing. There we go. Sorry about that. It should advance. And it's not.
I think you're in speaker mode right now, Tracy.
So how do I change that mode?
You know what, Tracy? Would it be easier if I just ran them from here?
Yeah, can you?
Yep, I'll do that right now. Bear with us, everybody. We'll go ahead and change that for you. There we go. Go ahead, Tracy.
Okay, perfect. So go to the next slide, please. Okay, so our founder, Craig H. Neilsen, he was a developer, and in 1985, he was involved in a very severe motor vehicle accident, which caused a high-level injury, an Asia motor sensory complete at the C3-4 level. And those of you that are involved in spinal cord injury research and rehabilitation knows how severe that type of injury can be. But Craig Neilsen was a developer, and he was a very determined, thoughtful, and successful man. He was brilliant and really tireless in his activities. And so after the injury, he went back to work with what his son likes to describe as a laser focus. And he continued to build his organization from a $27 million organization And over the next 12 years, he grew it into a $1.5 billion organization. He established Ameristar Casinos in 1993, which was, you know, it's like an umbrella organization that housed many different casinos across the western side of the United States. And in 2002, he set up the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation to really focus more research effort into spinal cord injury. He understood that the problem was very, very difficult, and he had high respect for the researchers and the efforts that were going on. But he also realized that he was in a very good position because of the resources that he had available to him, and that others that had injuries such as this were not so lucky. And so he really wanted to focus an organization to help advance programs and efforts that would support those living with spinal cord injury. In 2002, it was established, and he also had decided that upon his death, he would fully endow the foundation with the sale of the Ameristar Casinos assets. And that happened in 2006. So by 2011, the Neilsen Foundation became, you know, a fully endowed organization. And overnight, it grew from a pretty small private foundation to what we call a small private foundation with big reach, because we are the world's largest organization funding projects and programs in spinal cord injury. So next slide. This is just a quick snapshot on what we do. We have standing grant portfolios that are focused on creating opportunities in independence for individuals with spinal cord injuries. So this is focused on not only exercise basketball, wheelchair basketball games, but also maybe developing certain expertise and skills in areas that can become an independent source of income, such as the arts or other areas. We have standing research portfolios. The SCIRTS portfolio is the next one. It goes from stem cells all the way to clinical trials. We have psychosocial research programs, medicine fellowships, etc. So that's just an overview of what we do and how important it is that every funding opportunity we have that we award is focused on stakeholder engagement and making sure that we're targeting it in a way that produces as much value and relates back to our mission as much as possible. So next slide. So we started doing some research analysis, and I manage the research translational portfolio, the one that said SCIRTS on that last slide. And again, it goes from stem cells to clinical trials. But I was looking at my portfolio, and it's investigator-driven research. So that means that the researchers across the United States and Canada will submit proposals to me that are in areas that they're interested in working, and they will build those, research projects around them. Well, I pulled up this survey from Kim Anderson, and it was a survey that was conducted in 2004, and it asked individuals with spinal cord injury, what would be your research priority? Where do you think that the dollars that go to research should be spent? And this is a synopsis of what her analysis found. It was those with paraplegia and those with tetraplegia. You can see the differences in the colors were across the board, and what categories were the #1 priority, #1, 2, 3, etc. And when I matched this up against the research that I was supporting in the portfolio, there were some really big holes. One of the big holes was in sexual function. We also had big holes in bowel, bladder, and autonomic systems. And so the research proposals that I was receiving was really not what was reflected in the priorities that the stakeholders were identifying for us. So when you look across the research in general, there's actually very little research on sexual function anywhere, let alone in spinal cord injury. But when we look at autonomic systems, especially the area of urology is a huge, well-developed scientific field. And so we thought that we could really make some inroads by focusing efforts at the foundation towards bowel, bladder, and autonomic function. So if you go to the next slide, that doesn't mean that we left sexual function alone, because luckily in the system, the neuroanatomy shows that bowel, bladder, and sexual function is really co-located in the nerves. And so we thought if we made some efforts in improvements around bowel and bladder, we would probably learn a lot about sexual function as well. And maybe we could address that at a later time. So if you go to the next slide. We hosted a workshop in 2017. And in this workshop, we pulled all types of stakeholders from the community that had knowledge in bowel, bladder systems, and research in general. And it was a grueling 2-day workshop, but what we did was we were able to identify opportunities to really advance the field in these areas. So if you advance the slide, one more. What we found in summary from the workshop, the group identified 5 areas. One is restoring your awareness of sensory function. Number 2 was that neuromodulation has advanced so far and that it really wasn't being applied to bowel and bladder systems across the board, and there was a great opportunity there for us. We also identified rehabilitation, activity, and exercise. For example, those with a spinal cord injury using an exoskeleton. Just that use of the exoskeleton seemed to have a very positive effect on bowel and bladder systems, but there was really no linkage or no study done to really identify what that effect is. Education and clinical care standards was a big area that needed to be updated, and bowel physiology as well. So we published all of these findings in a paper, and then I hope that all of you online will be able to go and pull up that paper. We made it freely available. So it's open source publication for you to see what the details of the workshop were and what the recommendations came out as. Next slide. Okay, so now the foundation thought, what can we do to build upon this? We have a paper that showed what the priority areas would be. What else can we do? And really, as the foundations developed, we looked at, of those 5 recommendations, there were really 3 areas that needed additional support from the community. And those were spun off into what we call working groups. And one of the later speakers, the last speaker in this session, Dennis Bourbeau, headed up our neuromodulation area. And his job there was to really identify what type of roadmap could be built that would help advance neuromodulation technology for this problem of bowel and bladder after spinal cord injury. So advance the slide. So the foundation also has opportunities, and what we can do is we direct our funding sources in 2 ways. We either target funding opportunities or we call for proposals. And so if you advance one more time. Our targeted funding opportunities, we were able to send money immediately to the Paralyzed Veterans of America organization so that they could update clinical care standards for neurogenic bowel after spinal cord injury. And next slide. And then I was tracking the type of proposals that were coming in. And so like I told you, in 2016, the match was not really there. We weren't receiving a lot of proposals in bowel and bladder in my portfolio. And you can see that after the workshop and the publications and all this effort that we've been putting around it, more proposals were coming in. So it was almost a we almost increased our receipt of proposals threefold, but it still wasn't enough. So advance. If you look at this, this is the funding that was dedicated towards bowel and bladder over that same time, and it is steadily growing. Okay, next slide. But 2019, we start to see that we're leveling off again. So next slide. Sorry, these are supposed to be buildings. So what the foundation did is we identified a specific call for proposals, and we asked researchers to submit proposals that would address the issues that we identified in that workshop. Next slide. And so that bowel and bladder request for applications grew our funding sources tremendously. Next slide. And so from our working groups and the call for proposals, we've really advanced a lot of tools and techniques. One of the working group, this is not the one that Dennis will speak about, but we were able to publish also some measures for bowel and bladder improvement over time. And that is a publication I also encourage you to check out. And the last slide. So neuromodulation is where I'm going to end this talk. And a lot of the work that you will hear from Jennifer French, our next speaker, talks about the efforts that the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium has done in this area. She actually was part of the workshop that the NEILSEN Foundation conducted and helped us even establish what our goals and objectives were there. So I'll not take any of her thunder and hand it off to her. Thank you, Jen.
Thank you. Thanks so much there, Tracy. So thanks for the handoff. So I'm going to kind of take this story as we're going through it. Tracy really talked about what we did from a funding perspective. And actually, I sit on both the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium as the vice president, but also working with Dennis in the Neuromodulation Working Group. So just a quick introduction, the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, it was created back in 2018. We have 30 plus members, and we operate via projects that we focus on to be able to interact with the research community and industry. And we have a variety of projects that are constantly ongoing. I wanted to point out just a few of them, of which one is the survey. But to point out to this audience, the FDA does have a patient and care partner connection program called the PCCP program. It's a pilot program through the FDA, and we are a member of that, of 14 organizations in that pilot organization. It's really opening up a dialogue with the FDA, specifically CDRH. We also have a project that's going on in terms of guiding principles of how to communicate with that end user population. And that project is really kind of formulating what that language should be as we're talking between the research community and industry and being able to talk to people living with those conditions. And of course, our other active project is this one specifically that I'm going to go into more detail about is we created an advisory team for the Neuromodulation Working Group. So what happened? So we created this neuromodulation group. Dennis is going to talk more about the roadmap, but we had this dilemma in many of our conversations of how do we build a solution without really answering a lot of the questions of what does the end user population really need and where are those needs? So we said, we've got to take a step back before we build a roadmap of how we're going to develop things and develop technology. We've got to understand our community more. So we partnered, the Neuromodulation Working Group partnered with the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, and we created a consumer advisory team in January of 2018. Now it consisted of 8 people living with spinal cord injury as well as 1 nurse. So how did we build this criteria of this working group, we really looked at some key attributes. They had to be both male and women, of how they are anatomy, from an anatomy standpoint, not necessarily how they approach themselves or identify themselves as. And why we thought that was important is because for bladder in particular, it's very different between a male and a female. We wanted to get all those perspectives. We also wanted to look at the perspectives between paraplegics and tetraplegics because their living experiences are very different. We looked at upper and lower motor neurons for spinal cord injury, meaning that we wanted to get these different levels of injury. And we also wanted to look at various durations post-injury or post-diagnosis. And why is that? Because somebody that might be living with a condition for 30 years might take things on very differently than somebody that's only been injured for maybe 1 or 2 years and have what their lived experience is. And that's really the focus of why we brought on the nurse onto our advisory team, is because she has extensive experience in working with people with brand new injuries. And so she could really give that key perspective to the team. We opened the survey. We spent between January and June, we spent developing the survey and really coming up with some refinements of it. We opened it up from June 28th to August 29th. We received 528 responses, and we were able to analyze 370 of those. The results are in press right now, so we're hoping to have them published soon, but I'm going to present some of those results here for you today so you can get an idea of what kind of questions we were asking and what were some of the findings that we got and how that's going to drive the roadmap that Dennis is going to talk about here in a few minutes. So in the survey development phase, during that 6-month phase, we had some really key aha moments that took place that I think that we really weren't thinking about when it came to a spinal cord injury, and more so of what the end users were, and they were things that developers were not thinking about. And so one quick thing I want to say about the survey is when we developed it, we broke it into sections, and we paired people from the working group, the neuromodulation working group, with people from the consumer advisory team. So you always had 2 people and 2 perspectives as we were building up the key sections of the survey and how we were going to ask those questions. But then we brought it together as a group to build the whole survey. One of the aha moments was about hand function. That hand function has a key role in terms of how people do their bladder and their bowel routines, and that had to play into the questions that we were asking. We also found out the ability to transfer independently really will influence how they will respond, and also that transportation and financial barriers can be really influential on how people make decisions when it comes to their bowel and bladder management. So those were really aha moments, and we drove those kind of those elements into the survey to make sure that we were hitting on the key important things for the population. I can get to my next slide. There we go. One of the other things that we had from an aha moment in developing the survey is we had to give people a frame of reference. So sure, we're a neuromodulation group. That's who we're talking today. We understand the difference between implanted devices and external devices, but people that don't live in the space on a regular basis may not have that frame of reference. So when we looked at the survey and we developed the survey, we developed 2 cartoons to give people a frame of reference of as they were answering these questions. So we developed a cartoon of what maybe a mock external device might look like, and also what an implanted device might look like. So that way they can refer to that back as we were asking the questions. We also had to be very key on what definitions were. So as we know in this space, a lot of people, there's a lot of academic debate on what is neuromodulation, but we had to define that very distinctly for the end user population as they were answering these questions. So what did we come up with? We had a couple of really key results that helped to drive what the roadmap is. So one of the key points of data is, what type of clinician do people go to reference for their bladder and bowel routine? And overwhelmingly, urologists were the #1 people that consumers go to, but also primary care physicians were also those people right behind. So we have to make sure that when we're going out and talking about key issues, these are the clinicians that they're referencing to. We also wanted to know the question of, how are people getting their information? Where are they going to get the information about their bladder and bowel routine? Well, they're going to their healthcare providers and they're looking for those doctors and nurses and various clinicians that they go to be able to answer some of their questions. But look at what's behind that. Number two is the internet. So as we know, Dr. Google is out there, and we have to be able to address that if we're going to have a roadmap and really kind of drive what neuromodulation development will be. When we're looking at bladder management, here's a couple of key things that came out in terms of how people manage their bladder. We're looking at, they use clean catheterizations and medications for the most part for managing their bladder. Oops. And what are some of the key challenges that they faced over the last 12 months? UTIs came up, a urinary incontinence, autonomic dysreflexia. These are things that people are dealing with on a daily basis, and they told us that. What did we see from a bowel perspective? Well, from bowel management perspective, listen, the methods that they use is digital stimulation and manual evacuation, followed by suppositories and laxatives and medications. So overwhelmingly, we see how people manage their bladder and what methods that they currently use. But what are some of the challenges? Look at the challenges. This really was a bit surprising to us, is that not only do they have constipation, but they also have fecal incontinence. So two of those things we really have to take into account when we're looking at what are the challenges that people are facing. Some of the other kind of key things that came out of the survey is that approximately 70% of the people voiced the fact that their bowel and bladder routine interfere with their daily workspace and their daily social activities. And for those that were managing their bladder, their highest ranked priorities when we're looking at what they would like to have is to be able to empty their bladder without using catheters, and also to maintain urinary continence. Those were the two overwhelming priorities that came out of the ranking of priorities. And also the ranking for their bowel management was they wanted fecal continence and they wanted predictability, as well as reducing the time for their bowel routine. Those were very closely matched together when we looked at the results of what people's priorities are. So taking those priorities into account, we also asked the question of what was the likelihood that they would accept an implanted system over an external system. And we asked these questions in reference to the cartoons that we created. When we look at an implanted system, we find that people are relatively likely to take on implanted devices to be able to solve these problems, but they're also more likely to take on something that's an external device. So what was driving some of these likelihood questions? One of the concerns when we looked at specifically external devices, one of their concerns in terms of taking them on for the people that were somewhat to not likely were the fact that the inconvenience of wearing wires was important to them, but also the issue of being able to don and doff a device on a daily basis. So that was a concern as well. The concern when it comes to implanted devices, the implanted devices was really in terms of revision surgeries was their biggest concern, and also complications that are requiring the removal of that. And I have to say to this is that when we looked at the implanted devices, there was a real concern related to the surgeries. Those were obviously voiced by our consumer population. So I'm going to wrap that up. That was the voice of the consumer and really kind of the voice of people living with lived experience. And that's going to drive what our the roadmap will be. I just want to do a quick closing and recognition of the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium. These are our officers that are helping to drive this forward. We have a community spread across North America, and we recently launched the SCItrials.org finder to help drive connections for clinical trials. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we're going to go over and bring it over to Dennis. So Dennis, let's talk about the roadmap. I'm gonna, it would help if I unmuted him, huh? We can't hear Dennis talk unless we unmute him. Okay.
Okay, there we go.
Sorry about that.
I'm invited back into the conversation. All right.
Hosted error. My bad.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen. There we go. Okay. So thank you very much, Tracy and Jen. And I think this is the right order to give these presentations, to give you a sense of not only the narrative of how we went about things, but maybe even the kind of the importance. So I'm going to be talking about the roadmap, right, for advancing neurostimulation approaches for bladder and bowel function after SCI. And we particularly use the word neurostimulation to kind of get around some of the issues with defining neuromodulation. And it is not letting me, there we go, I have to click to advance. Okay. As Tracy and Jen mentioned, we formed a working group from the workshop that the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation hosted. But we also worked with North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, NASCI, to form a consumer advisory team. And so we've got folks pictured here. And I've put them in alphabetical order because really everyone had an important contribution. There was not some kind of hierarchy, right? And we wanted to make sure everyone was a part of the team and they were empowered. This group represents diverse expertise. You know, we naturally think about scientists and engineers and clinicians and their expertise. That's pretty obvious. But of course, anyone living with spinal cord injury is an expert. You know, that's a key expert, and one that is just not often included. I mean, engineering 101, we talk about problem definition is key. You can't go about solving a problem without a good problem definition. And what better way to do that by reaching out to those folks that have that kind of expertise in what the problem is, what's the challenge. And then there's a diverse background with this expertise in academia, clinical environments, advocacy, and industry and government and nonprofit foundations. So we think we had a pretty rich set of backgrounds to come together to think about this issue. So this is an overall figure for what we're talking about with the roadmap. And starting at the top left, integrating stakeholders, and that's really where we have to start with a lot of things in this field. And I've included what may not be considered an exhaustive group of the stakeholders, but 6 of the key categories we should be considering. And then moving into problem identification and potential approaches. I'll be discussing that next. And parallel to that is incentivizing translational research and clinical impact. So those two kind of go together, and they're not, they should be kind of simultaneous things. And then moving down, advancing potential neurostimulation approaches. How do we do that? And then again, we have 2 parallel efforts that follow: engaging and understanding regulatory and reimbursement strategies, and articulating a clear vision for clinical adoption and commercial support of an approach. Basically, those last 2, how do you get something that was in the lab or even went through a phase 1 clinical trial to really exist and be implemented clinically, you know, so that someone with spinal cord injury can receive it as an intervention. So I'm going to take these in turn, these blocks. So the first one, integrating the stakeholders. There are opportunities for each stakeholder group to proactively engage. And you know, we usually think about researchers and clinicians and the need for them to work together to go and to seek out funding support, grants from the funding agencies, and define a research project and a pathway. We argue that the inclusion of individuals with spinal cord injury and advocacy groups should be a part of that research team and that effort. So, you know, we include them as study participants, and we kind of think, oh yeah, they're study participants, they're part of the team. But they can be more involved in that at each level at each stage of research, from grant proposal writing to protocol development, analyzing or interpreting data results, disseminating information, and having representation at these meetings. So we have some concern that, you know, there are clinical meetings that don't bring in the PhDs enough, and we have engineering meetings that don't bring in the MDs enough. But in both cases, we also want to bring in those people that might benefit from the work we're trying to do, and have their voice heard. So the funding agencies have been encouraging input from individuals with SCI. They also have been doing some work in creating this integration. So for example, the Craig H. Neilsen Foundation hosted a workshop that launched a lot of this effort. And that was a good example of integrating stakeholders into getting a bunch of us together in a room and talking about where we thought some of the challenges were and where we should go, what directions we should take. So that's a good example of a funding agency driven integration. At institutional levels, we can be doing that also. The FDA they have patient-oriented outcomes, PROs, so that encourages you know, consumer input or user input for defining outcome measures, for example. The National Advisory Board on Medical Rehab Research has individuals in the consumer or individuals SCI on their board. And then integration within and across organizations. So as I said, within an academic institution or across academic institutions, that kind of integration is important. We can think of examples where that happens, and those are successful groups. Professional societies, we have professional societies that may focus on the research or on with PhDs or discovery science. We have professional societies that may focus on spinal cord injury and research there. But for example, the American Spinal Injury Association, Asia, they started off as, I would argue, a clinically oriented professional society, you know, medical doctors, but they are making a concerted effort now to bring in more and more research scientists and engineers into the group to integrate that effort. And the advocacy groups have, I think, been doing more and more proactively to understand the research enterprise, how research is done, and engage in that process and with the groups and other stakeholders. So it may be that a lot of the integration happens because the advocates are doing it. Translational pathway. So we want to incentivize clinical translation research, and that's a bit loaded, and that on its own could be a long presentation. So to define that, we have many researchers have gotten into the lab because they enjoy the thrill of discovery, and that's good and fine, right? So we don't mean to we're not trying to say that's something wrong with that, but we want to acknowledge that if you have someone who wants to be in the lab doing discovery and then tell them they have to do something else, you know, some extra work or some other kind of research, that might be challenging. But there are plenty of those individuals that want to engage in translational research, and then do they have the skill set and the resources and infrastructure to do that? We've had many conversations with researchers that they've been doing excellent discovery science and they want to translate it, but they're intimidated or they don't know what to do next or how to go about that. It can be very overwhelming. So with the funding agencies, we want to be able to articulate a clear funding pathway for translational research. You know, it can be very easy to think about a cycle of R01 grants within NIH and, you know, advancing your research program if you're a researcher. But what is the pathway to get something through clinical trials, phase 1, 2, and 3, as far as funding goes? And then we have plenty of opportunities here too that we can capitalize on. There's existing discovery science. So how much of that existing work can we leverage so that we're not constantly doing discovery science alone, that we can take some things we've learned and translate them? What are those things that look like that are panning out that we want to support and advance? We have previous translation successes. There's you know, the FindTech Vocare system, it is something that it's a neurostimulation system that's implanted, that has been implanted in thousands of individuals with spinal cord injury, and it works well. That is arguably a success. What can we learn from that? And then what can we learn from the things that didn't pan out, that are failures? So we want coordination between research centers, funding agencies, advocacy groups for running clinical trials. We understand there's a limited number of potential study participants. It can be, I mean, within an institution, we may be competing within a local population for people to participate in our studies. How do we engage that? How do we address that? And we think that coordination would be the key to do that. Moving on to regulatory and reimbursement. So this is one of the first things that becomes overwhelming for someone considering engaging in translational research. We may get comfortable with IRB protocols if we're used to that, but then, you know, what if we need an IDE, an investigational device exemption from the FDA? Do we know how to do that? Do we have the infrastructure or the support or the skill set to go about doing that? And do we have a regulatory strategy moving past the IDE? So is this going to be something that is going to get a 510K, a PMA, an HDE? Do we know what those acronyms are? So it may be helpful to find those people that have expertise in regulatory strategy and bring them into the team. That's something that a lot of us have been doing. It's hard to become an expert at everything, but if we find those folks that know how to navigate this, bring them in and they help. Similarly so part of that regulatory strategy is it's a risk-benefit equation. So we think we have an approach that's gonna work. Do we understand what the risks are? And what is the work we're going to do to define that and resolve it? When we get into reimbursement strategy, that's a slightly different beast. We think about cost benefit now. So there are existing codes that CMS, which oversees Medicare, Medicaid, through HHS, they define all these codes for covering procedures and devices, and insurance companies look to the CMS codes for how they're going to insure things. So if I have an approach that's going to cost, say, $100,000 for someone to get, but it only gets a coverage at $25,000 under the current codes, that's not going to work. So we want to have a plan for what's the cost benefit of the approach. Do we have something that's going to be viable? And again, this might be something where it's good to bring in some expertise, or at least think about this. And this is where, you know, we can bring in industry partners. They have to deal with this all the time. They're good at this sort of thing. We're trying to be sensitive to time here. Commercialization. So one of the things we hear a lot about is that spinal cord injury is considered a small market in a for-profit model of healthcare delivery. You know, so investors are looking at what's the billion-dollar market and how we're going to reach out to millions of people. And we've heard individuals from industry that want to serve the SCI community get dissuaded. You know, be advised that they have gotten the advice that the spinal cord injury population is small, and you know, so how you can have a business model that works there. There are examples of neurostimulation devices being commercially successful. So sacral root neuromodulation by Medtronic is successful as a neurostimulation device, but it is not just within the spinal cord injury population. In fact, it's not within the spinal cord injury population. That's for overactive bladder. But so we know that neurostimulation devices can be commercially successful. There's a question about, and we also know that they can be cost-effective alternatives to current interventions within spinal cord injury. So that FindTech Brindley device, Vocare was supporting it in the United States years ago. The cost benefit was there. But again, there were challenges with the market, and we can talk about why Vocare doesn't exist anymore. That's another whole conversation. but we want to understand that what these challenges are. We want to be able to demonstrate the value of an approach that, and know that we've got a company or entity that is going to be able to support this. So another thing we look at is another strategy. There's a lot of time and effort that goes in, that could be going into engineering devices. If we have an approach that's using neurostimulation, there are a lot of stimulation devices out there already. There are companies that support those. So we could adapt or reuse existing technologies. For example, there are companies that are working with NIH and DoD, and they're working in public-private partnerships, PPPs. So the BRAIN Initiative and the Spark Initiative are examples where companies are trying to want to make their neurostimulation technologies available and look at new indications. So again, we may be running into the challenges of that first bullet point: spinal cord injury is considered a small market, and are these companies interested in, research that is going to, impact spinal cord injury? And in some of these conversations, that may be, but we just need to be aware of that that issue and address it head on. So trying to wrap this up, there are several opportunities that we can be leveraging here. There's a growing understanding of the needs and preferences of individuals with spinal cord injury. So in my big picture of the roadmap, one of the, and I'll actually go back to it really quickly, I think it's worth looking at, problem identification of potential neurostimulation approaches. And there are a number of approaches that are being researched right now in sacral root stimulation, pudendal nerve stimulation, tibial nerve stimulation, and so on, implanted or non-invasive. And they're showing varying levels of success in application, and that's really something to look forward to. And Jen presented the work on our survey. We're doing, I think, a good job at engaging individuals with spinal cord injury to get a much better understanding of what is the goal. Those data from that survey are hugely valuable to defining what the goal is and what success would look like. We can leverage existing and emerging neurostimulation technologies to meet those goals. So we shouldn't be dealing with a number of engineering challenges. And it also makes it easier going through regulatory clearances, because if a device is already FDA approved for something, it kind of lowers the bar a bit for what it would take to add an indication or test it in a new indication. And we can learn from previous successful commercialization of devices. So the challenge is, including individuals with SCI. These are the 3 points that I really want people to remember from what I'm talking about. I want everyone on here to really take seriously that we want to bring in individuals with spinal cord injury into the research teams, into the research enterprise. We need to incentivize and support translational research efforts. It can be overwhelming. There are many challenges to it, but those are things that we want to be solving. And there are a number of efforts going into trying to address that. And then finally, articulating a vision for commercializing approaches in the small market of SCI. This is something that can be done. But even if we're working in a lab developing an approach, we do want to think about, what is this going to look like when it is implemented? And have that vision for that pathway. All right. And that concludes my slides.
Great, thanks, Dennis. Really appreciate what you've contributed here. There are a couple of questions that we want to bring forward here today. I think Anne asked the question. Actually, I'm going to unmute Tracy, as we want you to contribute to this Q&A. I think I can unmute.
Right there.
Oh, there you go. And I'm going to unmute Bill as well, because Bill has been really, he served on the consumer advisory team as well. The first question out there is from Anne. Anne asked that she would be interested in how they learned about the successes and failures, and more to the point, whether this will be published so that not only researchers but also other funders can learn from prior devices and interventions. Tracy, do you want to address that from a funding perspective? You know, how you guys took this on and how maybe other funders might be able to take this as a guide?
So for the NEILSEN Foundation, this was actually our first foray into developing a call for research proposals that was around a specific need, where we dictated really what we wanted. And we're evolving as time goes on. All of the efforts from that call for proposals have now gotten under contract. We have 6 of them, and they have different milestones. They're all working in different avenues, but they have milestones that they need to meet to show that they're making the progress they need to. And we're floating around some ideas on how to help them along that process. Because what I find is a lot of my grantees, they are successful researchers, but they're not communicating with stakeholders. So maybe they've researched a certain topic, but they're really not reaching out to people outside of their research community to get insight into help inform them of their device design and whether or not it fits into the lifestyle of people that they're developing it for. So in those milestones, we're looking at having points where we will engage with them and introduce them to different support resources, such as pre-IDE meetings with the FDA. We're also looking at different commercialization sources in small organizations like the Institute for Functional Restoration, potentially offering some insight and support to our grantees to see if that will help them build that bridge towards translation. Because the one thing that I didn't talk about very much in the slide is that call for proposals that the NEILSEN Foundation put forth. It had a goal, and the goal is that whatever device you're developing or therapeutic approach you're proposing, is that it translates to the clinic within 10 years. That is our goal. And our funding doesn't span that far. The grants were, you know, from 2-year grants to 5-year grants. But the pathway that they need to follow to get that device or that approach to the clinic should be able to be made in 10 years. And we understand that that is an aggressive goal. I mean, if you look at all the work that Dennis put into building this neuromodulation roadmap, you know, one of the key pieces is that you leverage as much existing technology as possible so that it can help you with those conversations that you'll eventually need to have with the FDA and, you know, finding partners to further take technology and actually manufacture it for clinical use. So again, I think in summary, what the foundation is doing is we're hoping to, with our structure, we've built a path that they can semi-follow, and throughout the milestones that we will be working with them under these grants is that we are introducing them to the resources that they need to actually finish the development of their technology.
Thanks, Tracy. Yeah, and I think, you know, there are other condition-based organizations or foundations out there that are looking at doing a very similar model. Our next question is from Leah. Leah out there asks, how can scientists connect with end users and address their concerns more actively throughout the research cycle? And also, can we list some ways that people can interact, have those types of interactions, and what those interactions look like? So I'm just going to do a very quick shameless plug of tomorrow at 3 o'clock Eastern Time. We're hosting a patient engagement session that is a much broader session on how we do patient engagement and what it's modeled like, sharing that with Susan Schaefer from the patientacademy.org or patient advocacy group. So we'll address that. But I think, you know, how do scientists interact with them? I think we are building, and there are a lot of condition-based organizations that have these types of what we call capacity building or interactions, so that researchers can connect with that end user and be able to address those needs. Dennis, do you want to talk a little bit about some of the many conversations that we had in the working group before we got to the point of having the survey?
We'll really try to keep my comments brief. This could be a long thing. So this is a fantastic question, and I see a few people kind of mirroring the same kind of sentiment, which is good. So the North American Spinal Cord Injury Consortium, United Spinal, other advocacy groups are worth contacting with to engage with them just in general. But then more specifically, so I'll give an example. So I've got a research project where we have 2 individuals with spinal cord injury that are a part of the research team, okay? And so they are, maybe you could call them consultants or co-investigators, but they're paid for their time, and they're a part of the team meetings just like everyone else. They look at everything we do, just like our engineers and study coordinators and clinical staff. They look at everything and give feedback on it. But we also make sure that they are empowered. We're not trying to use any kind of hierarchical or patriarchal system where we pat them on the head and use tokenism. Where it's an earnest, get their feedback on things. They might think of questions we didn't think of. So we've got a protocol. We've got a consent form. So we sat down and went through the consent form page by page, and anything that didn't make any sense or seemed weird, or they were able to tear it apart, just like our medical team can tear it apart and make sure that it's correct, that it makes sense. That then goes to the protocol. Does the protocol make sense? What is the study person going to be perceiving or experiencing to go through this? What kind of data are we going to collect? Does that data matter? And so then as we get the data, these individuals can be there for the experiments. They can help with recruitment and talking to our study participants and helping answer questions that may come up. I say helping with data collection. We'll have people that are trained to make fancy graphs, analyze data, run statistics on it. But when those data are presented, that still has to make sense. And so we have, people with spinal cord injury that will be able to look at those data as presented and ask questions, and they have to understand it. Otherwise, we didn't do our job. And they can give feedback. They can say, well, I had a question, can your data answer this? And then dissemination. I mean, how powerful is it to be able to go to a clinical or scientific conference and be able to stand back and have someone with spinal cord injury give part of the presentation? That's something that we're looking forward to doing. So that's an example of bringing that kind of input in. That is, small in that you have a few people on your team, but but what if you're trying to get a focus group together? So you have like a couple dozen people to give more, to get qualitative feedback on a larger scale. Or what if you're trying to do a big survey like we did with hundreds of people? And that's where maybe we can tap groups like these advocacy organizations to help us with that. So identifying these resources and treating them as equals on the research team is the way to go. And I can talk about that at some length. So if there are further questions, I'm happy to discuss it.
Sure, thanks. I just wanted to bring Bill Fertig into this real quick because we're quickly running out of time. But Bill, you are with United Spinal. You've been interacting quite a bit with researchers and industry. What are some of your experiences?
So going back 15 years that I've been with the Spinal Cord Injury Resource Center, I've literally seen an exponential expansion, almost a controlled explosion of interest and contributions by the consumers. So the fact that researchers are recognizing more so now, and funders as well, that the consumer needs to be a part of the design of the request for the needs and the participation all the way through to and ending up with being a focus group member. I think that's vitally important because in the past, what I've seen in relatively recent years is that researchers, academic researchers or corporate-based developers produced a product based on what they thought we would want. And then they said, oh, well, we better test it now. So let's go get some focus group members to test it out and see how we did. So it's backwards and it doesn't work well. So it's been very rewarding to be a part of some of these processes and these projects of North American Consortium from the beginning to help design the survey to get the right answers directly from the consumers. And fortunately, United Spinal has a broad scope and reach to reach out to the consumers in question, and then to bring that result back to you researchers to use that data to move forward and encourage and produce, solutions. It's the right direction.
Excellent. Thanks, Bill. So we are out of time, slightly over. My apologies. Thank you, everybody, for attending.